manifesting what we have in us. And so I have to admit that I am conditioned, and I'm programmed by a lot of modernist music that younger people haven't been exposed to. And so I'm programmed differently. And I'm trying to explain how I'm programmed here. Now, microtones. So I'm like this ecosystem, this musical ecosystem, and I go like this and I say, microtones, welcome. You enter into me and become part of my ecosystem. I'll play a little bit of Dan Lapel, playing my Poema Harmonical No. 2. And this is one of my first experiments with microtonal music, all of which I have to acknowledge,
yes,
because we come and we work together. Yeah, Daniel's playing this tonight.
At the concert at Salzburg.
Yes. And I don't have a recording of Daniel doing it, but they had Dan Lapel doing it. Dan Lapel did it at a virtual concert for a guitar society in North Carolina or something. So here, the guitar has only one string tuned down or up, down a quarter tone.
Down a quarter.
And in terms of this conversation about holding things, the microtones are so very extrinsic to my 12-tone equal tempered world that it's like lacerations. It's very, very jarring, and that's a good thing. I mean, that's the way I feel about certain dissonances. Certain dissonances, when we are holding harmonies, if we think of a minor seventh chord, I'll play Poema Harmonical No. 1 in a second. The minor seventh chord is so gentle, and if you start having 0-1-6-7s thrown in there, those are so extrinsic to the minor seventh sound world. And in minor sevenths, either a diatonic context or an octatonic context. Transpose the minor seventh chord by minor thirds, and you're in the octatonic sound world. Transpose the minor seventh by fourth or fifth, and you're in the diatonic sound world. But there are harmonies that are extrinsic to both of those. And so if you're holding minor seventh, how to prepare and how to make right a violation of displacement of that. But with quarter tones, they're so very extrinsic to everything. So this is my first attempt to deal with this, and the second note in the piece is bent, the string bent. So it's trying to acclimatize our ears for an interval that's not in a 12-tone, 12 temperate. And I don't think I'm completely successful here, because people listening to it say that it's a little bit jarring in a few places, and so but that just shows the depth of the challenge. But later in the middle of the piece, what does happen is that there are progressions in 12 EDO where you can hear the chord, and then an extension through some quarter tones, and then the next chord speaks to the previous chord. Like maybe one semitone is different, and so there's this progression that's extended through the quarter tones, and that's what I mean by holding. So I'm holding one harmony and keeping that fixed, and then the next time those pitches appear in those registers, maybe with one change, there's a progression, and then these quarter tones sort of meld with that progression and fuse with it in a bizarre way. That's what I mean by holding things. So here's Dan Lapel. He runs New Focus. Last night, the Galan trio, Petros, was asking about New Focus records. Those people are our friends. They're the guitarists. In New York, guitarists run everything. Dan Lapel runs New Focus Records, and David Starobin, guitarist David Starobin, runs Bridge Records. And the guitarists are not. It's just really funny. Like, anyway, guitarists just sort of, we can have the ability to carve out some little fiefdoms here and there. And
thanks for the publicity.
So this Dan Lapel, who runs New Focus Records, he's a brilliant artist, and he's a big freelancer in New York, and he's played Augustine's music and my music. So Daniel's going to play this piece tonight, and it's really very ripe, and I'm very excited about it, and I'm so grateful for Daniel for the work you put into that. Thank you, thank you. So.
Möchtest du gerne deine Lieblingssongs anklagen?
I want to subscribe to the premium, but I can't because I'm in Austria and I need a VPN. So here's this. This last neutral third. You know, that's my attempt to find the neutral third is something that's really in us because of blues, and so I'm trying to connect with that, of course. And actually, the very first bend in the piece is a slightly wide major second, which is on its way to a minor third, which is also very bluesy. So these things are in us, but you know, I don't know enough about makam because those have these Phrygian cadences with quarter tone leading downward, which are wonderful. And also, I don't know enough about string quartet intonation because when they have the first inversion chord, they like to make the third really low. But I don't know if you have any experience of this with Jonathan, but I think that probably means that they're playing something more like a just intonation third. Mm-hmm. And you know, I've been in plenty of rehearsals where we were discussing these things, and the string players are talking about make that third really, really low. So that's very interesting. Of course, when you have a piano, it screws it up. And the guitar is I worked with a guy named New Band. There was a group called New Band. They had custody of the Harry Partch instruments, and I was one of their players until I got fired because you couldn't work hard enough on those instruments. And Dean Drummond is the name of the guy who was running it. And he died tragically at a rather young age of cancer, and he was the boss. He's the one who hired me and fired me, and so. Working with those instruments, I played the adapted guitar, which came here 6 years ago, 6 years ago, and the adapted guitar I recorded on it too. There's me playing with Harry Partch on a recording on the adapted guitar, and at the end I'm singing, "Hey yo, don't go do." He has some Native American song at the end, and so this is my first exposure to microtones, and it immediately shows you how, when our 12-tone ears are so deeply ingrained, and then you immerse yourself in the Harry Partch instruments, and you start to it's like the floor falls out from underneath you. I think I'm going to move on to some other quarter tone thing. I'll talk about the piece that was done last night. I'm going to play a little bit of that. Because that was on my mind when I was just discussing this talk. So it's an example of a very, very conservative, cautious entering into microtones as a way to extend this palette of held things. So it doesn't happen until much later in the piece, but first I'll show you how the piece gets off the ground, and then we'll go to the microtones. See, it went away. It's not on the speaker anymore. Oh, I think I have to do it in Sibelius.
Maybe, yeah.
You have to go into sound in audio engine.
I think I have to restart it too.
Yeah,
No, you shouldn't have to. Just go into sound. So get the main screen up.
yeah, we already did. That's why it was sounding.
So thank you for Sibelius to do.
Yeah, sometimes an extra program. Yesterday was Zoom. We didn't know. So we went, no, it's...
Here, try this. Oh, good. So, get this score up for a second. Now, this piece, I have this tendency to do things that are too complicated, and this piece is kind of complicated. And I hope it holds together, I don't know. But this ninth chord, this collection, this is thematic for a long time, that I hold on to this, or try to hold on to it for a long time. But it's a subset of the all trichord hexachord. So, I'm one of these dinosaurs that comes from the battle days of 20th century modernism. Elliott Carter just adored this collection, the all trichord hexachord. It's got 2/5 a tritone apart. It's a crazy dissonant thing, but it has some very beautiful dispositions. And Carter was fascinated by it for the same reason that I came to be fascinated by it, because it's a hexachord that sort of flies apart. It bursts at the seam and scatters to the four winds. So what I've done in this piece is I look at subsets of it, and I treat subsets of it and extend them and develop them. And it's stated here, this ninth sounding harmony, very diatonic. I like to stick with diatonic things because they're more in us. So that's one of the things that some of the modernists, including Carter and Milton Babbitt, they were so stubborn. They wanted to be able to avoid diatonic harmonies. You know, that goes back to Schoenberg. He avoided the diatonic harmonies.
Let's go to questions, 5 minutes of questions, like in a couple of minutes.
So
Thank you.
this piece progresses through, develops, and then at a certain point after the second half of the piece in the slow section, I wanted microtones because I wanted a sound that was absolutely extrinsic to everything else in the piece. And that's the way microtones are. They're very, very, they really stand out. I'll play a little bit. I'll try to get into this.
to questions, please, so that we have a couple of minutes.
We heard a few of the quarter tones. So by not having quarter tones for most of the piece, the quarter tones have a big impact, and it sort of, that color washes off on this section of it. I don't think the computer's playing the quarter tones very well. So my big point is that I'm starting to feel that the quarter tones or various microtonal in between things can be a very important part of my sound universe, and I'm just discovering it very slowly. I'm not diving into cold water. I'm getting in very slowly. Yes.
Thank you very much. So we go to questions. It's 5 minutes late this morning. Thank you so much. Congratulations for your work last night. Congratulations for your work. Anyone would like to throw the first question for William?
I'll make a comment.
Yes.
It's interesting. I think it's not stylish, provocative thing to say that you're a tonal composer when you're really writing nonsense music. I mean,
really?
Yeah, in a conventional sense, there's no, I mean, you say it's not functional, but many would say that is what defines tonality, right? Functional tonality. But
It's a triad.
But I think it's really interesting when you make the comment of harmony. You're talking about different things, which I think is interesting. You're talking about motivic things, saturation, and I find it interesting when you were playing that guitar, electric guitar piece, an array composition, which essentially is the stratification of 12-tone rows formed in such a way that they create unfolding aggregates, bundles of all 12. It's how you work in those aggregates that does create a sense of harmony. What I find interesting is that you clearly have a harmonic sense, and it often comes down to something as basic as pitch replication, which is something that Milton Dawe did a lot. And so the idea, it's not quite prolongation, but it's the idea of dwelling in a sonic area. And I think it's really interesting how that does create a sense of harmony. Your music often, to me, I mean this as a great compliment, sounds like Babbitt on Quaaludes. You know, Babbitt kind of just wallowing a bit in his harmonies. And then finally, I want to say with regard to harmony, that piece you just played, they weren't in tempo. I hope they're not here.
Yeah, no, they weren't in tempo.
That would be.
It's only being recorded, but.
Yeah. It's just interesting. One thing Milton Dawe always advocated was to push tempo. And one of his tempos, I pushed to 80, he often said, and you were at 80 there. And this is interesting, when things are out of tempo, you often miss motivic things locally, but you can hear broader harmonic things. In this format right here, it sounded to me much more harmonically cogent.
Good.
It's very interesting.
Good,
I think that tempo can affect harmony in that way.
It's a harmonic, it makes sense to me. And I'm glad it's starting to make sense to you. And I write these pieces, and I don't know how they're going to work with real instruments, and it's a process, because I have to teach the players, I have to bring them into the world. And also, I just responding to your comment, thank you very much. I don't know anything, you know. I'm feeling it out. And I think that's what I hear from some of you. I was talking to Richard about the microtones, and you said last year or 2 years ago, you're trying to find out what it's all about by doing. Yeah. And so I think we're all on the same page there. So in terms of harmony, like I hear lots of discussions with Milton Babbitt's with pitch repetitions, and I feel it, I understand. I feel it, I don't understand it. let's not say we understand anything, because you know, one aspect of music is that everything is absolutely unique. But you know, I don't operate that way. I do have this, you know, premises that I launching pads, you know, so I like to have an idea that I want to set into motion, which is that's always the spaces where we're contending with. Is everything unique, or are there things that we do that we can sit down and do any time? And that's what Hindemith taught to Olga Goreli and some people in the United States. If you're not feeling inspired, here are things you can sit down and do. That Hindemith was important. That was important to Hindemith. Yeah. Anything else? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. By the way, William, one thing, there was a lecture the first day about bending and focusing on Maurice Ohana Tieto. He uses the microtonal bending. And Luke Villavicencio from New York, you might know him. He was talking about the bending in the guitar and the microtones. And but now we are Maestro Jonathan Dawe will be speaking about. I just want to make sure I push the button. Yes. Okay.
Dance performance sounds so gentle.
About this highlight we had this year, the 10th anniversary of Mikrotöne Small is Beautiful, the opera Micromégas. And the highly innovative and cultured work of the American composer Jonathan Dawe joins Baroque imaginary with a modern mix cast with dynamic, dramatic flair. Cited for his quirky, fascinating modernist variation on earlier styles, Time Out, his music involves the recasting of energies and sounds of the past into decisively new expressions through compositional workings based upon fractal geometry. Recent pieces and productions have been described as music of such vitality and drama by the New York Times, a break-squealing collision of influence, Boston Globe, and provocative, Time Out. Recent operatic productions include Being Ariodante with Ensemble Échappé at the Italian Academy, New York City, Nero and the Fall of Lehman Brothers with BOP Ballet, Opera Pantomime Montreal, in addition to the premiere production with Ensemble Échappé at the Italian Academy, New York City, and Cracked Orlando, Drama per Music and Fractals on the Beyond the Machine series at the Juilliard School. Other recent performances include Ordinary Dust with bass baritone Devon Tynes, Vile Recital Hall, Oroborium, New Juilliard Ensemble at Alice Tully Hall, Labitorium Artificiosum, 5th String Quartet, Ruisi Quartet, Concerto per Fractals, Dolce Forte, for String Quartet, Jazz Quartet, and the Flowering Arts with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Dawe is a senior member of doctoral graduate studies at the faculty of the Juilliard School. Please welcome Jonathan Dawe.
I'm happy to be here today. I thought that for my offering I would just offer a informal snapshot of some of the compositional things that I was working on with regard to Micromégas. Augustine and I met, I believe, in September in New York City, Lincoln Center, and just in talking, I kind of quickly did the math and found out that somehow there was a 10-year anniversary involved in the symposium. And so I did the foolhardy thing of suggesting an occasional celebratory work in the form of an opera. And I was in it to win it. And so in that time, moved ahead. At first I was thinking of another work that I was working on which involved microtonality. Quickly that became impractical to imagine how that could be mounted here. And so Micromégas was actually designed for this particular symposium, for the XIII. And was something that I thought was manageable. And it does involve, on an intrinsic level, microtones, but also some aspects of fractal geometry, which I would just like to share today. One thing that was at the tail end of my bio was a large work that was premiered in 2005 by the Boston Symphony Orchestra that did involve a significant amount of fractal geometry. Interesting and happy anecdote, it was written up on the front page of the Boston Globe as a preview before a symphony of flowers and fractals. The piece was based on Charpentier's Les Arts Flotsants, and over in Cambridge, Benoit Mandelbrot saw the article. Mandelbrot, of course, the pioneer of fractal geometry, and we got together for a drink before the premiere performance, which was quite interesting. We really hit it off right away. His wife was there as well. And it was quite interesting in talking to him that in many ways my deep knowledge of mathematics is limited, but so is his knowledge of music. And it's interesting to note that I would never think of myself as a true mathematician. In fact, the only math that really makes any sense to me is that which is involved intrinsically with music. Then I can do math at a rather high level. Other than that, I have trouble working out change when I'm at the store. Is that probably my knowledge of mathematics was more engaged than Mandelbrot's was of music. And he was actually a deep music fan, so that was interesting. But I moved to the anecdote and conclusion of my story is that after the premiere, he came up to me and he said, I enjoyed the piece very much, but I have to be honest, I didn't hear any fractals. And that didn't really upset me because I knew that they were, at least in my composition, a working manifest on every dimension of the work. And what came out was nevertheless interesting. But it made me think over the years what he really intended to hear. What did he want to hear as a musical fractal? And there's a wonderful line in the, I think near the opening of his pioneering work, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, where he has a line where he, and I paraphrase, he says, the connection between music, between visual arts, between architecture, and the way fractals work in all of them might seem to be very cohesive, but this is actually a very superficial idea, the connection. I remember Milton Babbitt, the smile he cocked it when he heard that. He enjoyed that idea very much, that we often think that there is an intrinsic connection between the visual and the oral. But this is a problematic and challenging thing. And I think especially if you are involved in bringing in fractals into the domain of music, fractals really work most comfortably and robustly in the visual domain. We know this. They can work in literature, they can work in pure mathematics. Of course, that's probably where they actually reside in the most healthy way. But when we're dealing with fractals in music, it is interesting getting back to the idea, I didn't hear any fractals. Many of my fractals were mathematic in the way that they joined my compositional thinking. But we all know that the F word, fractals, we think of visual things. So I'm increasingly interested in how we can take the visual and transform that, map that into the musical. And one needs to acknowledge that music is simply music. And we, especially I think in the Western world and with Western music, we deal with metaphors all the time in music. Especially when we're talking about music, the level to which we use metaphors that reside in the visual world. So I could be teaching, and I say the composition begins here, and by the time we get to the Ron, what does this have to do with how things actually unfold in the dimension of time, large scale? Or the idea that, the double bass is down here, and then boom, the piccolo up here. What does that have to do with the actual speed of vibrations? That really is what the different pitch differentiation is all about. These are metaphors. And probably the boldest metaphor that we have in music is that music resides in a pitch space world, which we always think of so often as visual. Here, a low pitch, a high pitch, X and Y axis, yeah. Here's the beginning of the composition, here's the ending of the composition, or of the phrase, or of the sounding pitch. And so with regard to that metaphor that we use all the time, I used to be criticized for thinking this way, but I have no problem with it. I have no problem with embracing that idea of metaphor. So Bill, last night, hearing your piece in the afternoon, and the other compositions as well, it's really interesting. I think musicians often hear music differently. We construe it differently. That I was hearing vibrations coming from stage, but at the same time, I was concocting this type of canvas in which the piece was here. And I kept wondering, how close are we to the end of the composition? I didn't think of it this way, but I was thinking of a type of pitch domain, which is an X and Y. And so increasingly, I'm thinking about how can we really have those metaphors work in a more robust way. And it may be getting away from the numbers that I've been using. The numbers are beautiful and numbers are friendly things with regard to music if they're treated with respect. But how can I make a more kind of real one-to-one relationship in the way that we actually hear the music and create that type of visual concept of fractal geometry. And getting down to the idea of one of the most intrinsic things about fractal geometry are shapes that are appearing in different scalings and proportions, that are embedded within one another. So the idea of Micromégas came out of a interesting novella, short story by Voltaire of 1752, in which is one of the earlier sci-fi stories in which from a distant planet, a gigantic creature from a gigantic world, very Jonathan Swift in a lot of ways, Gulliver's Travels of course resonates throughout this, and is going to finally get to Earth. And then in Earth, of course, the humans are tiny. They have a dialogue with regard to what Earthlings are like. And it's very Voltaire in that the end, the Micromégas and his friend from Saturn ask, what is the meaning of existence? And they say, well, we don't know, but we know that everything in the universe was made for us by God. Rather an arrogant idea. Micromégas at that moment burst out laughing and said, okay, yeah, we've had enough, we're leaving now, but we're going to leave you a book about everything in the world. Because you know what, it's a very kind of Twilight Zone-y too, And so here's this big book, okay, we're going to sayonara, we're taking off now. And then they take it to the Institute of Science on Paris, and they crack open the big book. They take a look expecting for all problems of humankind to be solved, and there's not a goddamn thing written in the book. It's entirely empty. And so it's typical Voltaire in that you're not quite sure, is that Micromégas, are they kind of sticking it to the Earthlings, like, we're not going to share your secrets? But more to the point, it's more likely that we realize at the end that Micromégas doesn't really know anything. He's a big fake, and so it has that kind of misogynistic tone of someone walking around acting like they kind of own the place, but they really don't. But anyway, getting back to more interesting things, the work is based on one of the areas of, let me see if I can, fractal geometry that has interested me over the past, 2 decades, I would say, the idea of cellular autonoma. And that is the idea of having cellular structure which will grow over discrete moments of time. So a tick over time, like click, 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 click. And each time the structure will grow and recede depending on a particular algorithm. The algorithm will really depend on what the current disposition is around it. So if this happens to be empty and this actually is black, that means in the next generation that won't come on. Or if this is that, it might disappear in the next generation. And it's Stephen Wolfram who is really one of the great pioneers of cellular autonoma. And he has a really kind of interesting take on things which, these very basic types of algorithms which really hold for every next level of the generation of the growth here are very simple. They never change. The algorithm does not change. But what can come out of a very simple algorithm, rule, if you will, pattern of behavior, this and only this, if that, can often lead to rather interesting chaotic behavior. And not just chaotic behavior, but chaotic behavior which also will display some form of patterning. In a sense, a type of natural, fractal, recursive quality. So you see here, by and large, it is rather chaotic unfolding, but you begin to see certain types of patterns unfolding, triangles. And his main thrust is that, these might be really some of the beautiful keys of the irregularity that exists in the natural world. That the natural world might actually, in its DNA, be very orderly. And so that's a compelling idea. Well, if that is the kind of cookbook for nature, what about the idea of applying that to music? And growing music by the very same laws that can dictate how a tree will grow. Because we know these things happen in nature all the time, certain levels of irregularity, but at the same time patterning that will be repeated. And I think for most of us composers, if not all of us, we can see how that can be quite attractive with regard to a compositional type of tactic, to have motivic things, harmonic things that repeat, but never the same way, but always making reference. At the same time, new things can pop up that we didn't expect to happen. That's what makes music fun, if not beautiful. So the idea here is that in some of the earlier music, now this happens to be one of the many different CAs or rules that you have. This is the famous Rule 90 here. Also, it creates a Sierpinski triangle, Pascal triangle for some of you who understand it that way. And these are things which I have over the time mapped into musical types of structures. And there are different ways to do this, but I will just be quite direct. The patterning begins with the top square right there, and then with regard to the lookup rule, the second line down is the next generation, then the third generation, and so on as it moves down. One can, in a very simple way, imagine every black dot equals a note. Let's just think of it that way for a moment. And so we could think of that top note square right there, let's just say as a half note. In which case, what we have down here then is a note, a rest, and another note. We have right there. Then we have here, note, rest, note, rest, note, rest, note, rest. It's a very simple way of dealing with things. I would put it to you that I often, in music of the past, would have a box not represent one note, but a group of notes, or a motive, if you will. So then you have a type of potential canonic thing occurring. In the beginning of Micromégas, your ya-da-dee-da-dum is a motive, and that repeats over and over again and overlaps. Why does it overlap? Aha, because of these. So this will create the potential for repetition. Now, one of the interesting things about making a connection between the visual and the oral is that when you look at a painting of a fractal whatnot, imagine that. I did it. I'm in. Now, it takes some time for me to kind of really construe everything, but I'm done. We know that music doesn't work that way. That music unfolds in time. And you say, okay, this is not an issue. I'm going to show my fractal by having a motive here, then two motives, then motive, rest, 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 motive, and then a whole bunch of the motives, and then motive, and then a long strain of nothing, and then a motive. But you know what? I'm already bored. I'm already bored. But fear not, because one thing that music can do, which is closer to the visual, is the big C, counterpoint. And so the idea of having the stratification of ideas comes closer to that notion of what we do when we see recursive structures together visually. So then imagine, if you will, that from here to here, all of these motives are running simultaneously together. And you end up with a counterpoint. And early on, I came up with some very interesting counterpoint by doing just that. One can then, I think, easily see the idea of the embedding, of the recursion, of the self-similarity. Imagine that this motive here is a motive that lasts for a measure long, whatever that measure is. Then these three are going to be 3 times as fast as that, embedded within a measure. So a sense the motive in a giant triplet. In which case, down here, that motive will be very fast, and that very fast. You end up with an interesting type of mosaic of sound. Now, one thing that's really, I did a lot of that. And it led to some really quirky music, where you hear a motive, and then quick little motives inside of that, and quick little motives. Too much, and then it's just too much counterpoint. So as a composer, we have to know when enough is enough with regard to counterpoint. Have a 5-voice fugue, 6, too many, okay, fine. That type of thing. But what it led to is a type of frenetic sound world. Because you have the big on top, and then you had things smaller and smaller, embedded. And you could use irrational rhythms, 7 in the time of whatever, and then 9 in the time, and then 10 in the time. And it could be very exciting, especially when you got to these, because these would actually create a groove in a John Adams kind of way. And then interesting. And I would apply that to music. I have a piece, many pieces would apply that to fragments of Baroque music and create very interesting type of fractal Baroque things. But getting back to the idea of how do we really make metaphors that more deeply connect the experience of looking at that piece of art? I was watching something very simple that we've all seen on the computer, which was a bunch of images that would zoom in toward us. And each time we looked and the images here would move out, we'd go deeper and deeper into it, and you'd see the same imagery come up. So here's a big Julia set thing, and then that moves out of the view of your computer screen, and you see what was tiny here get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then that would flood. Oh my gosh, it's just never ending. And it creates the illusion, and I stress the idea illusion, that you are getting pulled into the computer, because you are not. What's happening is that things are getting bigger, and they are leaving the visuality of the computer, but there is an illusion that it is doing this to you. And by doing that, it's as if you're getting pulled in. It's like when you're on an airplane and you're waiting for every taxi, and all of a sudden, no, we're moving. And no, the plane behind you is going the other direction, right? It's that type of thing that goes on. So I realized, you could do this by not honing in, by not having that as a particular length, and that these get smaller and smaller, but that you have that, and when these come here, these are the same duration as that gets repeated, it gets pulled longer. And so things get pulled longer and longer and longer. You always keep going from here to here to here to here to here down the same pulse, but the things behind it get bigger. And that creates the illusion of things doing like that. And this is something that I'm working on right now. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's what composition is all about. Now, with regard to Micromégas, I used this particular pattern for the work. And in the past, the more recent opera I'm doing for Opera de Montreal, Atis, the Tragédie d'Atis, I begin this way, from the bottom. I begin with the largest ratio and get smaller and smaller and smaller. So in Micromégas, here is the structure of the work. And the work begins here, and each one of these boxes here represents a quarter note. The work is usually built from 4 quarter note motives, and usually in pairs. So if you look at this one down here, that is 130 quarter notes long, plus the 4 or the 3 that make up the 4 note motive. This one here is 2 quarter notes shorter. So what we end up having is a ratio of 130 to 128, polyrhythm. And as the piece unfolds in the half an hour length, the ratios become simpler and simpler until you end up with 4 to 3 and 3 to 1. And that's the very end of the piece where you start to actually hear things move quite quickly. Now, that's all wonderful, and that kind of sounds like hyped up Elliott Carter with these long polyrhythms, but how do you really do that compositionally? I mean, you can't have the opening section of Micromégas have quarter notes with a big bracket that says 130, in the time of whatever. Yeah, you can play a quintuplet. You can play 7 in the time of 4 or 8, but you can't do that. And what is more, can you even hear that? Can you hear that ratio in quarter notes, that quarter note equals 80? And so, basic technology to the rescue. What can do it is the computer. And don't need logic for it. Don't need Pro Tools. Sibelius does it. So I just have a measure that is not 4/4, but 134. That's a big measure. Yeah, you have to go into a really small font size, but you know, again, it doesn't mind doing that. Still, when I do this, always, I'm from the generation where I just expect any moment to see that pinwheel and then the crash, but it hasn't crashed yet. So you do that. You do 130 on one line on the piano, just chord, boom, 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 and 128. And you see what happens. Oh, and you can hear it. By the third quarter note, you begin to hear that flam. Not only do you hear the flam, but just like the old windshield wipers, they don't do these anymore. For those of us from the 1970s, we know, you know, boom, together, and then they go out. Richard knows what I'm talking about. Because we were little kids in the back, you know, driving with their parents in the rain. That's all we could look at. Was, get there, it's almost there, it's almost there, boom. So there will be these cycles that will happen in the middle, where all of a sudden they'll line back up together. Very exciting. And then they go off again. And then at the end of that cycle of 138 to 128, they'll come back again. But still, how do you notate that? So people can actually play it. And here, you have to cheat. So what I do, and this is real kind of practical discussion here, because, you know, what we end up getting just in the structure of the unfolding of the work is this. So we have, at the opening of Micromégas, you have two lines of material. The guitars, bum, ba, dee, da, dum, bum, ba, dee, da, dum, bum, unfolding. And then we have the violin, ya, da, dee, da, ba, da, dee, da, ba, over and over again. Now, I would add and interrupt. Where are the microtones yet? But each repetition is an eighth tone higher or lower. So I have the strings and I have the guitars tuned, I guess it's 48 EDO, right? So they're 4 before you get to the half note.
25.
Is it 25?
Yeah, 48 EDO.
Yeah, 48 I think, yeah.
25 cents,
Yeah.
sorry.
So, and look at the musical material here. This is that motive, dum ba dee da dum ba da da. When we move into the next section, which is a little bit shorter, right? This material here goes to another instrument, but it's repeated. And then new musical material, contrapuntally, is put on top. The A material, bye-bye. It goes. So you have a type of cycling. It's a very interesting effect in that there's a new line of counterpoint that's added each section and one that leaves. So you can have what's kind of called a transposing canon, a canon that very gradually transforms from one to the other. So by the end of the work, this is at the very end of the opera. These are the polyrhythms that you end up getting. And that's a very different type of polyrhythm. They don't need to be notated a particular way. And so there is a kind of grand accelerando that occurs. And you know what? Why not? Because the work is Micromégas. So Micromégas is coming from a gigantic planet and solar system. Why not begin with gigantic ratios? And when we get to Earth, not only we get to Earth, but we get to the point when the humans say, oh my gosh, it's all bullshit. That it's just a very simple type of polyrhythm, 2 against 3. Boom, and then done. That final chord here is 1 to 1. But I still haven't told you how we make this playable. Yeah. Boom. Yeah. So this is kind of difficult to see. And I get a lot of attention on the airplanes when I do this, with people sitting next to me. They think I'm usually, one person thought I was cracking a code. I was a cryptologist and I was working on something. You can see on the top here, there is the opening rhythm, ya, da, 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 in 130 in the time of 128. And what I do is I quantize. At the beginning, I quantize into the smallest unit where a player won't yell at me, which is a 32nd note. Yes, yeah. As I get closer to simpler ratios, then I quantize to a 16th note, which helps that idea of things kind of simplifying. And what I simply do, and it takes a lot of time, and yeah, it's a real pain, is that I get the note that is right behind, the 16th note that's right behind the note of the irregular rhythm. Now, that spacing there, it looks like it's way off. but it really isn't. It's just by a hair. And what you can do, if you are, when I was actually kind of nervous about it, is then after doing all of this, I would play them together. And you would instantly hear if you make any mistake, if it's off by anything more than the slightest hair. And I'm thinking, with regard to music, that's close enough. That's close enough. And so, down here, you can see how things become to look more like playable music when you get to simpler ratios from here to here. Repetition is an interesting thing. And Bill, yeah, you did mention repetition. And it is really interesting how we composers from a modernist, educational domain, if I can call it that, are horrified at the concept of repetition. I studied with Richard Hoffman, who was the last student of Schoenberg, and there really was this idea of taboo of repeating. A real modernist composer would never repeat. That's why? Why? We know perfectly well why. It's not the same thing when you repeat because you repeat it. It's different. It's in a different time. It's in context of what came before. But there's no doubt in fractal geometry, repetition is something important. And it really is how you deal with repetition in a way that's meaningful, deals with transformation, and deals with not changing at all. That weird type of paradox. And so having microtones in many ways is a powerful idea. Because in repetition, we know when we go to a concert and we hear a pattern piece, and we go, okay, here we go. When you know that, oh, this is what it is. And it might turn into something incredible, or it might just, oh, there it is. It can be problematic just to repeat. But the idea of making that connection between the way that we construe an imagery that's fractal, that deals with recursion, but not just repetition, right? It's not just like an Andy Warhol, boom, 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 boom. It is the way that everyone's just a little bit smaller or a little bit larger that creates an overall gestalt. So we see the overall picture, at the same time we're pulled into the verb of it all. The actual growth, that's the kind of definition of gestalt, right? It's not just the form, but it's how you create the form. All of that together, very Germanic kind of idea. More than one thing. So the idea of semitones allows me to create repetition that has multiple levels of transformation.
Okay, so this is the last lecture of the first block, the last day. So I would like to welcome Leonid Galaganov, also very known to the Micromégas Society already. Was here 2 years ago, right? First. And then he was also in this collaboration again with the Village Trip and with Rory Sapir-Fan for music and William Anderson. He was hosting the Micromégas Society in New York for the microtonal village, and in which you presented again. And so now your lecture, Polyharmonic Spectral Geometries in Catherine Lamb's Parallaxis Forma. Leonid Galaganov is a composer, improviser, and multi-instrumentalist who explores relationships between the spontaneity of raw emotion and precisely defined ideals, perfection and longing, extremely rational and existentially absurd. His music is shaped by a broad range of both traditional and experimental nuances, especially feeding on contemporary improvisation, devotional rituals, new music, jazz, and world music. His current research mainly focuses on microtonality, multi-channel spatialization, and the exploration of new structures for improvisation. So please, let's welcome Leonid Galaganov.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here again. It's quite a treat to be so immersed in microtonal ideas and to hear beautiful embodiments of these theoretical concepts that we work on. And something I'm interested in particularly with this analysis, as you'll see, is how does the theory get embodied by the musicians, especially in an acoustic setting. And this presentation is about Catherine Lamb's piece. I don't want to be too redundant since Lawrence already gave a presentation on another piece of Catherine Lamb a couple of days ago, which was very insightful. And but I will just read her bio on her website, which is Catherine Lamb is an active composer exploring the interaction of tone, summations of shapes and shadows, phenomenological expansions, states between outside, inside, empathy, and the long introduction form. So she currently lives in Berlin. Originally she's from the US, and she's a student of James Tenney, which will be touched upon later on. And she works, well, I'll touch on relationships of different things that she's interested in, but mainly here I'm interested in rational intonation. I guess as we're dealing with just intonation or extended just intonation, we're dealing with rational numbers and not irrational numbers like with the tempered system. So something that's important with her is that she thinks about pitches not with Latin letter names, but with numbers. And that is a big difference because, you know, when we say an A, that doesn't mean as much as if we say a 7. A 7 means that if there's a certain kind of inflection to it, and there are certain kinds of relationships which she uses to compose and orient in pitch space. So I'd like to just leave this program note from the piece that I'm focusing on and play just an excerpt to begin with the sound one. To play this without even talking about the instrumentation, because to my ear, phenomenologically, I experience that I can't even say what instruments are playing, or if it's electronic instruments or if it's acoustic instruments. And just a second. These are in fact acoustic instruments, except I guess the electroacoustic guitar that is played with the E-bow throughout, and I guess you see quite an unusual set of 9 wine glasses. And here is part of the score. So this is from the beginning of the excerpt that we listened to. Since maybe not everybody is familiar with the Hedgie system, which is, a big system, I'm not going to go over all of it, but I'll give a really quick recap of just the things that you need to understand the notation. So the Helmholtz-Ehlers just intonation system, it defines every prime number with a special accidental, right? So here we have the partials, which primes are indicated, so you can see that 5 is a prime number. It has this arrow down, which is a syntonic comma lowered. The septimal chroma that's used there. And for this piece, we won't really need any other accidentals, any other prime number, new accidentals. However, I would like to point out an interesting feature of it is that if we multiply 5 by 5, we get 25, and so that's 23, 24, 25 gives us 2 syntonic comma lowered. So we can see that this is the cent deviation from equal temperament. 14 is an approximation, it's actually 13.7. If you add 13.7, if you minus 13.7 and minus 13.7 adds to about minus 27. Similarly, if we multiply 5 by 7, we have 35. And if we go to 31, 32, 3, 4, 5, we can see that the septimal chroma is there and the syntonic comma lowered is there also. And in the cent deviations, 14 and 31 is 45. So it's an interesting way of how these qualities that are introduced with every prime number, they get multiplied throughout the different kind of octaves, and how they relate to each other. These identities of the numbers that are not prime numbers but multiplications of different prime numbers. So these are some ratios here that if we look at what are the ratios that are formed, they're pretty high up there in the overtone series. And how does an acoustic ensemble perform such complex ratios? So Catherine Lamb comes up with this really beautiful way of combining fixed pitch instruments and non-fixed pitch instruments. So the non-fixed pitch instruments, the voice, clarinet, flute, alto saxophone, they play off of the fixed pitch instruments. Throughout the piece, the wine glasses will play these pitches as they're exactly tuned. The guitar plays either open strings or natural harmonics. Violin and cello, they mostly play natural harmonics or open strings, with very rare exceptions to that. So now we can take a look at how these fixed pitch instruments over here, how do they cue the non-fixed pitch instruments? Well, we can see in the voice, above the voice, that it actually is telling the singer what to listen for, exactly. So how to find their pitches, and I find that really beautiful as a way to embody these really complex ratios, because we're not, I don't know if a singer is thinking about 189, like how do they find that? Whereas there's this way to kind of have either these pitches be cued by the fixed pitch instruments, or they can be found with much simpler ratios. one thing, I mean, I guess to note here is, right, that pitch was 27, and then over here I wrote it down as 216. I mean, that's my subjective. I mean, if in the context, if we had a previous chunk of the music, we wouldn't really perceive these necessarily as those partials, but since that's the starting point of the excerpt that I played, kind of started out assuming that we could hear this as those partials in that octave. In here, because we have all of these ratios, they are divisible by 3, except 160, so we can't divise 160 by 3, so then that would be our kind of lowest common denominator, and it would give us, like, basically all of these pitches actually relate to an E flat that is like -3 E flat, way lower, below the audible, you know, what we're able to hear. And we're going to come back a little later to in the tunings, like why do these instruments need to be detuned in that way, so that you know, these are the cent deviations. You can see that an E flat is 49 cents off from a regular E flat. Just try to sow that seed of mystery there to come back later and create a more interesting arc to this whole thing. And you know, this is an idea of a geometry that's being created with these tunings, with a 7 limit just intonation. So you may be familiar with the Neo-Riemannian tonnets, and you know, if we don't look at these two bottom rows here, we just have, this is a chain of fifths, so all the horizontal lines are perfect fifths, and then I'm using the Heiji notation here. You know, these are major thirds diagonally moving from lower left to upper right. These are minor thirds diagonally moving from, well, the other direction. And you can see that if we keep stacking just 2 thirds, we get a B, 2 syntonic comma lowered, that is different from a B that would be the extension of that chain of fifths after the E. What makes it a non-conforming tonnet? So the conforming tonnets, it would be where, you know, we would just go back from a G, we would go back to a B, the same B that we came but from, and it's like a loop where you have 12 pitches. Non-conforming tonnets is infinite in space because you can go any direction into infinity. And so the addition here is these 2 rows at the bottom. These are the septimal, the 7 limit addition. So I built this in like a Johnstonian kind of fashion off of the, like, just building the 7/4. So I relate, I create the verticals to indicate the 7/4 interval from, so that would be the 4, that would be the 7. And so it gives us kind of 3-dimensional lattice. That's, I think, Harry Parch has it flipped, like he has a different representation of it a little bit, but I find this useful to visualize like that. And we're going to come back to the tonnets in the development of the piece, but this is just so that everybody's on the same page of where are the intervals that we're looking at. So the spiral is a tool that Catherine Lamb uses in her composition, and I find this is issued by Irv Wilson, and what it shows us is the kind of the spiral nature of the harmonic series. So we can see the different octaves, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and in every successive octave we have new numbers added in between the previous prime numbers. which are then becoming their octave transpositions. Something that Catherine Lamb does, interestingly, that Irv Wilson doesn't do is, well, Irv Wilson doesn't show to us the relationship between, what we can't see here is the relationship between 5 and 15, or the relationship between 11 and 33. If you go to Catherine Lamb's website, you can see that she actually shows those relationships on her spiral, where she uses all the identities of intervals that have to do with the harmonic 5, their circles, or the harmonic 7, their squares, so you can kind of see those relationships there too. And so this is really useful for also in her large-scale harmonic motion. Catherine Lamb doesn't just go from one place to another randomly. She actually travels within a spiral that is all related to one common root that may not even be audible in the composition. And that is where the Hertz ratios come in, is because this particular composition, so she uses simple numbers. So for example, she uses 1, the fundamental, as 1 Hertz, for example, or 5 Hertz, or 10 Hertz. Some kind of a simple number that then all the Hertz frequencies, they become really easy to calculate, and they become very visible for the performers when they also see and when they can practice the intonation with the tuner. And something that is really kind of an example of how we could modulate down a spiral, for example. So let's imagine if we just hear a chord in the beginning of the piece, and we perceive this as a chord 7 to 6 to 4. When we would hear it, we wouldn't even hear that they are all syntactically, unless we have perfect pitch, but in this case everything's detuned anyway. If all of these are syntonic comma lowered, we can just think of this as G, D, and F, that is septimal chroma lowered. So we hear that as a 7 to 6 to 4 relationship. Then if later on there is E flat introduced, then all of a sudden this pitch becomes like the 5 or the 20, that pitch becomes the 30, and then the F lowered by syntonic and septimal chroma becomes the 35. And then, for example, if we were to, at the center of our spiral, we could have A flat, then we could go down to that A flat, and then we would get this other ratio. But what I'm kind of interested in is how would we hear that chord, the very last one? If this was the context, because in polytonal contexts, it's all about the context, like what makes us hear this as one harmony or two tonalities working against each other, or in counterpoint with each other. Here, I think that the strong presence of a fifth, E flat and A flat, could give us a sense that we're in A flat, but then are we really going to hear this as 105th partial? Or because this structure is also so strongly ingrained into our kind of musical hearing, we would just hear that as like a 7th, or like a sus, or like a chord without a third, a 7th septimal chord without a third. And I think that it has to do with the context, and Catherine Lamb kind of explores that way of hearing things. So now I'd like to go to this performance note idea and kind of just talk about the form of the piece a little bit so that we understand what's happening. And in this piece, the voice really guides us through the whole thing, and it creates the narrative arc. And all the other instruments are kind of part of the overall harmony. And the piece has 7 sections. And I listened to her podcast recently. I'm blanking on her name right now, the name of the podcast, which is released recently. She talks about how, as a student of tennis, he was so focused on form and on the perceptibility of form, a really clear form, and all of his students, even though he wasn't forcing that onto them, in some way they really share that kind of style of composition. If you know Tenney's work, you can really hear the kind of the process of what's happening. There's an expansion, or there's like this very clear, perceptible process that happens throughout. And in this similar way, Catherine Lamb's piece, Parallaxis, Forma, has 7 sections where, so in section A, the voice starts with only playing 3 different kinds of identities of F. And we can see that they're really far apart on the tonates. And only a couple of minutes into the piece, then she goes down to an E lowered by a syntonic comma. And then the other instruments create a harmonic context around that. I'm going to go through the different sections now. You can see the expansion of the pitch space on the tonettes. So, the pitches that are grayed out are the pitches that are missing in the section. So, here, these pitches were present. Now we had an addition, but also some of them are missing now. So sections D, E, and F, these are climactic sections, which all use this combination of notes, and that's section G, the final one. So something to note here is that the starting point was this, which had 3 septimal identities and a lot more of the identities of the partials related, pitches related to partial 5, and throughout the piece we kind of moved a lot more into the area of the septimal identities. So there's that motion throughout the piece. Something that I found interesting was how in these climactic sections, which I'll share, these combinations of pitches, there are 12 of them. So I don't know, that could be, there are 12 pitches, however, they're kind of, different identities. Some of the pitches have different identities to them. So this is the beginning of the piece. We can see that it starts with the voice just altering the vowel. That gives us a different spectral shading. And there's really, there are different ways to see how do we hear, are all of these pitches part of one overtone series? I don't really hear it that way. I think that what we hear in the very beginning is very clear. We recognize that sound. It's the 7 to 6 to 4. But however, at this point, when these clusters come in here, there are different ways to perceive it, and that's kind of where I think there's this polyharmonic space that gets opened up, because we have these spectral identities of these units of pitches, that imply different things. For me, you know, we could see these as part of a E-flat overtone series, and then we would hear that F septimal lowered as the 70th partial, but being held over from the context of a 7 to 6/4 chord, I'm more inclined to hear this as there was one clear harmonic unit, and then here this is B flat, part of a B flat unit that is 18, 20 to 21, which to me is a much more kind of recognizable unit that comes in. And kind of coming back to also the idea of finding these pitches, like if we think about this truly in, let's say we think about this in E flat, as part of a series of E flat, when that voice at the fourth gesture goes up by a syntonic comma, that ratio would be 567, which is like, I don't know if a singer would really think about it in that way, but they can actually find it, I think, a lot easier as a 9 to 8 with the electric guitar. And in fact, that's a mistake up there. 4 to 3 doesn't really make a 4 to 3. Septimal lowered F doesn't make a 4 to 3 with the cello. So I think that's a mistake, unless, I mean, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, it should just be an F natural if it was a 4 to 3, but based on the hertz, it is actually supposed to be a septimal lowering of the F there. So I'm going to play this example and see if you can hear with me the appearance of this harmony while we still have a sense of the original harmony that we started from, and really listen to how that change of that identity of the F makes us travel to a different kind of plane on the tonnettes.
Yes, and we go to questions.
In the beginning of the piece, Catherine Lamb starts on this F4 with different identities, and as a spiral throughout the piece, it gradually goes lower and higher until it reaches its extreme high at F syntonic and septimal chromal lowered F5, and there's actually a kind of an interesting development how it goes from F4, different identities of F4 to different identities of C5 to different identities of F5, much like the tonal melody would highlight scale degrees 1 and 5 throughout. But the really interesting thing I find throughout the piece is how there's this other, for me, in my hearing experience, the polyharmonic aspect of it is that we have this tension between harmonies that are very clearly overtonal and related to the overtone series, to these kind of more ambiguous spaces where there's different ways of interpreting it and it's subjective what we're actually hearing. And what helps us shift between the different planes is what the voice is doing with these very small shifts in the tunings, as the voice is listening to locking into simple ratios with electric guitar in this case. I think that guides our attention to traveling on the tonettes to a different plane, and that's what happens throughout the piece. One last thing. Oh, this is a recording that I really enjoy. There are a few different ones you can find. That's the one that we've been listening to. So, in her 2019 Harvard lecture, Kathleen Lamb talks about the form of the spiral, and she says that we shouldn't be today, but after all the psychoacoustic composers like Marianne Amaché or James Tenney and their exploration of the music that's being born in the mind, the interiority of the listener, versus just like seeing it on a flat plane. She mentions this interesting thing how when we hear two tones, we actually hear 5 pitches. So if there are 2 instruments playing 2 notes, so we're hearing the 2 pitches themselves, A and B. This is just an example. Then we hear the sum tone, which is the summation of these frequencies. We hear a difference tone, and then we hear their first common partial. So one thing to note is, that if these are in just intonation, the frequencies are 500 and 400. We actually do get all these other pitches that are appearing through the psychoacoustic phenomenon are actually part of the overtone series that the pitches are from. And I think that for the concept that she chose, if you remember the program note about that the ensemble in this piece is a shading of the voice, really having even these very complex ratios, because they are part of they're related through a series, one spiral. They all feel, all of their partials and their sum tones and their different tones, they reinforce each other's overtones. So we kind of get this blending between all of the instruments that we don't really get with any EDO system. Because in any EDO system, if we had 504, like in 12-tone equal temperament, the sum tones and different tones would no longer be locking in exactly with the ratio, the prime number ratios. So with extended just intonation or rational intonation, we get this really beautiful resonance that is created when all the instruments that are in tune with each other's overtone series are kind of creating this really united sound. And just one thing, in this case, if we imagine that we have 6 instruments, if they were all monophonic voices, between 8 instruments in that ensemble, we would have 28 possible pairs. And if every pair also creates 3 additional tones, the sum tone, the difference tone, and the first common overtone, then we get 94 additional reinforcing tones that are reinforcing the overall resonance. So we get between 8 pitches, and in this case they're actually, some of them are playing double stops, but if it were even just 8, we're hearing, even not counting the overtones of every instrument, we're hearing 92 tones already that are creating this very multidimensional, beautiful spectrum.
you very much, Leonid, for being here. I would like to remind some participants. He was part of the fifth book. It's on the back. You can, for those who want to buy it, and also on this one. Also, if you want to buy, we have 13 articles here. One of them by Leonid Galaganov, and the other one on the back. It's very known to the society. Congratulations for your presentation, and I would like to ask in the group if anyone has any questions for him.
Just firstly, before asking any questions, the music's really beautiful, isn't it? It's just really, really gorgeous music. And I think you get at one reason why it's beautiful, which is the reinforcing sound world of all of the pictures. So I really appreciated that. I think something you're wrestling with is and it's something you can wrestle with a lot of just intonation music, is there's a kind of a web of lots of simple relationships, but they lead to very, very complex relationships. I wonder what your kind of model, you started to talk about it with the beginning of the piece, moving from something very, very simple and then into something quite difficult to understand from a spiral perspective. It's quite hard to nail everything down to that very, very, very low E flat. What's your kind of model for thinking about that over longer spans of time? Also, I know this piece by listening quite well, but I don't know the score. Where does it go in the longest kind of progression? You talked about the unwinding of the spiral. Does it remain fixed to that low E flat? Does it go somewhere else?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And actually, it's the E flat. It doesn't start with an E flat and it doesn't end with an E flat, and it never really plays like the E flats that are played are actually quite high in the range. So that's, I think, is an interesting way how it's relating all the ratios, but it's never giving you like that overtonal chord like a lot of spectralists tend to kind of give you a very apparent kind of recognizable overtonal sound. And I like how with her music there's always this kind of shifting, like the meaning of the word parallax. And I thought that it was interesting that, to me, that was something that the idea of perceived an object against the background is perceived from two viewing locations. The two viewing locations gives me this ambiguous sense of polyharmonic space. But yeah, something you mentioned, about the reinforcement of the each other's overtone series and how it all, in just intonation, all fits into one series. I was having these discussions with Haas when I took his class in Columbia, and he really was inspiring to me to think about how the beautiful thing isn't hitting those ratios exactly. The beauty is in our humanity of not hitting them. Like, if you listen to a drum machine play a metronomic time, it gets boring pretty quickly. But having a human who's implying, you can clearly hear the reference point, but hear their humanity against the very robotic mechanical ideal. In the same way with a lot of electronic, like if you just generate sine waves that are perfectly hitting all the ratios, it's not very exciting to listen to for a very long time, as opposed to, this ensemble really plays it very precisely because of the fixed pitch instruments that kind of are really set there, and all the natural harmonics are, creating a very precise embodiment of the theory. But still, I think the beauty really comes from the human aspect that's always like trying to find its way to the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
You use only overtones, not undertones?
In this piece, yes, she uses only the...
In other pieces?
Yeah, in other pieces she uses undertones, and she goes also in exploring higher limits also.
Yeah.
It would be Sun Cave the guitar player, was with us a few years ago. It would be nice if the musicians would say any thoughts about the execution of this piece, because it's something very important. We had this concert yesterday, we had presentation of the piece, and then the execution, you know, it's not so precise, but it's a very good point what you said actually, in comparing the beats with the pitches. Actually, this is exactly the beauty, the organicity of this. Any other questions, please? Otherwise, Leonid, thank you so much. Congratulations.